Hellas.
Wow.
Oh, Switzerland. And Italy. Salve.
Buongiorno.
Salve. Sera. That's nice. That's a nice feature. Austria, Luxembourg, UK. It's great to see the European family get together in that way.
Oh,
Well, there we go.
Belgium.
Does it update in real time or do you have
Yes,
to? Okay.
exactly. Yes. It's updates.
Amazing
See
technology.
people still coming in.
Last time we also people from Africa, so let's see this time.
The Netherlands has a bit of ESC quality. Ooh.
The
Vatican. Well, maybe we have Papa.
also
Hello.
represented.
No.
Hello.
Hello.
Warm welcome.
Very happy.
Thank you very much already for the voting in the Slido. You will be able to use the exact same Slido for questions throughout the presentation. I'm now going to share the agenda of today. Let me do that. Moment.
Yeah, thank you, Christophe. We can see it, perfect. Hi, everyone, good afternoon, and I will say let's start, and thanks for your patience. My name is Maria Claudia Bodino, and together today with my team, with Christophe and with Athena, we are very delighted to welcome you again to this last iTalk before the summer break. This series of initiatives has been organized by the Digital Innovation Lab, that is a new platform from the European Commission. Basically, this innovation lab, we call it iLab, is about exploring, but also concretely experimenting and try to promote new innovative ways where we want to create collective knowledge. And basically, we really want to improve the way public servant works and also how we can improve public good in our daily life. We are pretty young, so this is our first public event where we open the door to people outside the institution, and we have participants from different areas and also from different sectors, from academia, from private sector, from public sector, of course, and also from civil society. We are looking for new synergies, new partnership and cooperation with existing and already running initiative under, let's say, the umbrella of innovation in the public sector. So we are also looking for potential synergies with institutions, GovTech, startups, academia. Please feel free to get in touch with us in case you're interested. You probably know, because maybe you already attended the previous iTalks. We started in middle June. The European Commission has declared this year the European Year of Skills. So this is why we had decided to create this series of iTalks, really focusing on different stakeholders and how they are trying to address the lack of data skills, looking at use cases, initiatives, and also challenges from different angles, not just from internally from the public sector, but also we have people and the speaker from academia, from private sector in the last weeks, also from some GovTech startups. Last week, we had a great talk with David Eves from USL. And on Monday, we had another inspiring exchange with Barbara Baldi from the OECD. Today, we are really honored to have Gaby Umbach. Her current research focuses on interaction between knowledge, but also evidence, data, and governance. And she's a part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies of the European University Institute in Florence. She leads the Global Governance Programs Research area on knowledge, governance, and transformation. Today, Gaby will share with us more information and more input, and also interesting perspective about statistical and data literacy in policymaking. Thanks a lot, Gaby, for your time. Thanks a lot for your contribution to this initiative. And again, thanks Athena and Christophe for your support. Gaby, the floor is yours, and yeah, enjoy your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for, first of all, for the invitation, Maria Claudia, Athena, and Christophe, and for the initiative, actually, to build such a new community of practice. And as you said, which goes beyond academic perspectives and embraces the world of practice, the world of business, to identify something that is in some countries, except obviously for Estonia, as we just discussed previously, quite new to public administrations in Europe, related to forms of digitalization, e-governance, and e-government. And therefore, as you said, the quality of data literacy and statistical literacy is something very, very important. I'm going to share my screen now for my presentation. And I have I hope you see that.
Yes, yeah. Perfect. We can see, Gaby.
Perfect. And some words of some footnotes to the presentation. You will find the slides quite wordy. I prepared them for also a function of post-presentation memory. So let me talk you through the elements that I'm going to share with you, first thing. Second thing, within the slides, you will often find statistical and data literacy, because I use these terms on purpose to, number one, highlight different quality of data we use, while statistical literacy potentially refers more to official statistics and methodological questions, technical skills. data literacy covers something that I think is important to understand, which is obviously the idea that statistics and data are also developed by private entities, and this data has a different quality. So this is the first point why I differentiate the two. And the second point is, and there I cite with Gold in a paper in 2022, he described that data literacy points at an augmented statistical literacy that pays tribute to the fact that the role and relevance of data in policymaking has increased, and that the role of data goes beyond the pure descriptive or diagnostic functions of statistics and policymaking, and entails also a normative dimension. And this is pretty much the talk, the idea of the talk. I will focus on how can data literacy contribute to evidence-informed policymaking, and the guiding thread is, in a way, the aim to make us understand what is particular about data literacy, statistical literacy, in evidence-informed policymaking, and why this requires, and that's my main argument, a fundamentally multidimensional statistical and data literacy approach. So let me take you through the individual parts of the presentation. I designed it in 3 parts. Some initial thoughts that frame evidence-informed policymaking and make us understand why evidence-informed policymaking creates a particular situation for data use in policymaking. Then I'm going to set the scene a bit for this multidimensionality and dive into what is particular about data use in public policymaking and why data use has different effects on knowledge and on governance. And the third part then frames what type of multidimensionality I mean is essential if we talk about statistical and data literacy in evidence-informed policymaking, and also what benefit this multidimensionality has for the use of data in policymaking. If we start with some initial thoughts, and I hope, yeah, that's better. If we start with some initial thoughts on the characteristics of evidence-informed policymaking, I do think it's fair to say that the approach and the practice both very much relied on this understanding of rationality and scientifically rigorous evidence for policymaking. It focuses very much on the fact that evidence, factual evidence, should inform policymaking without affecting the aims of policies, the objective of policies. So in that way, evidence should contribute to a rational justification of policies. So you see a very rationalized approach to policymaking. Within this understanding of evidence-informed policymaking, we do have different types of evidence that are taken. And we also have something that we label an evidence hierarchy, right? So evidence can be data, modeling, assumptions. It can be cost-benefit analysis, qualitative insight, but also insights from behavioral studies or judgments and experience as evidence. This evidence hierarchy, however, claims that evidence that comes from more rigorous scientific designs and research approaches is better to inform policymaking, and therefore statistical, especially official statistics, statistical and data evidence has a particular role to play in evidence-informed policymaking as one of the preferred sources of evidence to underline and to justify policy decisions. The evidence used, obviously, in evidence-informed policymaking has to satisfy utility dimensions, right? It has to be credible, salient, and legitimate. And that places a particular burden on evidence quality and on evidence use in policymaking. And you already see here the particular role of statistics in that evidence hierarchy. If we come then to the challenges, so far the characteristic very much focusing on a rational approach to policymaking, the policymaker, and here I subsume actors involved in policymaking and in decision-taking, so public officials and policymakers, politicians. So these people are enlightened and want to use the best available evidence to inform best possible policy decisions. Yet the challenges with that approach is that they obviously hint at a very technocratic understanding of policymaking that the reality, especially of recent years, does not really reflect. So what type of systemic and procedural challenges do we see when we look at evidence use in policymaking? Obviously, and this directly relates to literacy, public administrations, politicians oftentimes are not necessarily equipped to engage with different types of evidence, right? Data stands out here again because the methodological technical skills requirements are very, very demanding for individual policymakers to use data. A second point that is oftentimes ignored by this rational approach to policymaking is the idea or the understanding, the insight that is gaining more and more traction, that policymakers will not necessarily consider all available factual evidence, and not because they don't understand it, but because they might have intrinsic motivations to disregard certain types of evidence or to consider certain types of evidence. So here, the idea is that policymakers and those engaged in policymaking use the evidence that support their causes rather than the best evidence available. So bounded rationality and bias is something that is difficult for us to unlock when we need to understand why a particular piece of evidence hasn't been taken up or has had a different impact than we had initially thought. Something that is very interesting in many of the EU institutions try to bridge that gap, but it's the gap of the worlds of politics and the worlds of science and research, right? We do have different logics in these worlds. So while the world of politics might strive more to reduce uncertainty, the world of research and science naturally lives from uncertainty as a motor of invention, innovation, and research. So these two worlds and the logics of production of the two worlds not necessarily speak with one language. So the problem of science policy interactions and creating trustful environments of science policy interactions is something that is very challenging in evidence-informed policymaking. The technocratic approach to this rational idea of policymaking obviously also could potentially increase the danger of anti-democratic tendencies. And here, things that we saw in the past, tendencies and dangers of politicization of evidence and statistics, not only as pieces of information and knowledge, but also in an institutional approach, right? So challenging the role of national statistical offices, of chief statisticians, has in the past been challenged and politicized to a very strong extent in some countries, and I will come back to that later. So what do these characteristics and the challenges of evidence-informed policymaking do for data use and also for data literacy? Obviously, they impact on data use, but also vice versa. The data use impacts on evidence-informed policymaking. And I will highlight three elements here that I think are important for us to understand that we need to go beyond numeracy and extend literacy understanding for data use in evidence-informed policymaking in a multidimensional way. So referring to data use and the knowledge and governance effects it has, referring to the motivations and functions of data use that are essential to understand that a perfect statistical knowledge and literacy might still create problems when using data in policymaking, and therefore requiring a multidimensionality that goes beyond mathematical skills and statistical skills. So let's start with some basics, obviously. Data used in evidence-informed policymaking is there to support policy planning, implementation, evaluation. So this is the sheer functional, factual functional purpose. If we look into that, it, however, also goes beyond descriptive and diagnostic functions, and that's something that we might lose along the way of the search for best evidence and best data possible. So what we do with developing, collecting, and framing statistics, we actually reduce the complex real world to make it more tangible. And we see that in categories like sustainability, equity, but also in terms of health questions, education standards. We very much develop approximations to reality that, however, through measurement, then become reality of societies and political systems. And this is something where we see that data use, by its very definition, being a proxy to something, measuring something other, standing in for something else, a societal phenomenon, impact on policymaking. They reduce the corridor of policy intervention to what is measured. And questions that are not measured, elements or phenomena that are not yet measured, indigenous knowledge, mental health questions, corruption as a part of crime, they also not form entirely part of our societal reality. And here we see that evidence-informed policymaking, through the requirement of factual evidence to inform policymaking, supports this normative and political framing. It really very much decides about inclusion and exclusion of groups, for example, gender disaggregation according to physical requirements, different forms of particular needs, different indigenous groups, societal groups. So it's included, excluded, and we have a certain login when using a particular data in a policymaking process for a particular group, a certain moment in time. So what we do is, by using these data, we actually define the problem at hand. And this is also the logic of justifying policy decisions in data-based governance. That very much is at the heart of data-driven evidence-informed policymaking. And as we will see in a minute, this has also impacts on how we govern, not only what type of knowledge we agree, but how we govern. So using data in policymaking actually makes statistics an instrument of collective political action. And we should be extremely aware of that, because this inspires a world of different motivations and functions of data beyond the evidence content. So what do I mean with knowledge effects of data use in evidence-informed policymaking? Obviously, the use of statistics and the collection of data is part of the knowledge production process of a society, right? And it gives us a certain drive towards metrological ideas and attitudes towards defining macro-social realities. So it naturalizes what we measure. I already mentioned that. School education, formal education, school attainment, years in formal education, as something where we say, okay, this is a good education. And then came PISA tests, so the skills part. Okay, no, we have to reformulate and redefine what we measure and how we define the containers, right? So the knowledge that is created through the data use in policymaking creates opportunity structures and empowers different groups of society differently. It also creates, and that's a strong phenomenon in everything we see around the World Bank, for example, or the United Nations SDG indicators groups, it creates these transnational knowledge systems where, especially if we zoom out from the European context and zoom out to the global governance context, obviously we also have history coming back in, post-colonial, neo-colonial tendencies in measurement. If we look, for example, in SDG 16, that defines governance structures, good governance, that has a strongly laden Northern Hemisphere tradition of understanding governance, right? So we actually enter not only within nations a power game of using and defining, but also in a global context, something that is really important for us to understand. So the part of data contributing to multidimensional judgments entails something that we have to keep in mind, and that is extremely important for the literacy part. So what do I mean? Knowledge is highly contextual, obviously. If we understand, as I said, education in a certain way, this might work for Italy, Greece, Turkey, it might not work for Tanzania, Peru, China. So we need to be aware of the issue of translating, localizing, and contextualizing data when using it. So it has a granular and fragmented impact on the knowledge we create. However, at macro level of the EU, the United Nations, we define them in a very homogeneous way, as if they were to be adaptable to all different types of systems. So the knowledge effects. If we look into the governance effects of data use, we see that it's actually, so using data has become part of political processes, but it has also become a political process in its own right. The open method of coordination in the EU that is very much based on data use, the semester, the SDGs, I already mentioned that, the World Bank with the doing business indicators that have been discontinued because of a politicization moment that I will refer to later on. So all of these elements have become instruments of governance in their own right. And with that, they have acquired political power resource character. And that's something that shouldn't be underestimated. So if we are feeding in statistical evidence for policymaking, it's not just to understand how a policy can be assessed, how much progress a society in a particular aspect has been able to deliver. It's actually a power resource that empowers and enables political actors in a different way. So you already see the different elements that are so important to understand that just the technical knowledge of data science, how important it is, and what triangulation means, what aggregation, disaggregation, correlation means, is not enough for a modern public administration and administrator to understand when using data. So here, the questions of how to define the purpose of use, the quality of use, very much supports this soft impact and power regulatory tool, quality of data use in policymaking. So in a nutshell, then, what does that basically mean for this multidimensional skill set that we need to form and educate people to acquire? And this very much breathes the ethical dimension of data use and quantification. An extremely important part to understand is obviously the normativity. There are motivation, interests, and values behind data use. Linked to that is obviously the question that data, statistics, but also all other forms of evidence used need to be legitimate, transparent, and produced in an accountable way in societies. That has a certain shade on private data production, on interest group NGO data production, but also on some of the NSO, so the National Statistical Offices in countries where data quality and capacity of statistical capacity is not that much advanced. So what we see here, and that's something that I think should be underlined, and I assume you have discussed this previously already, that flawed or missing or monodimensional statistical literacy can indeed support something that we by any means want to avoid: contestation, politicization, and misuse of data. This leads and links to all the post-truth discussions and the disinformation, misinformation discussions that we have. And we actually have seen since 2011, obviously, the biggest case in Greece there, but throughout the years in different examples, Tanzania, Turkey, Fiji, the World Bank with the doing business indicators, as I said, in 2021, elements where statistical offices, national statistical offices and official statistics in general have been challenged. In Tanzania, we had in 2018 the amendment of the Statistics Act, in the 2015 Statistics Act, where it was declared illegal to bring into circulation non-official statistical data, which obviously was a block towards all NGOs creating their own indices. We had with the World Bank doing business indicator, the question about Chinese influence on particular statistical data that even led to the retirement of the entire exercise, which was a very important exercise for development policy. The same holds true to Turkey just in 2022, where President has actually fired the chief statistician because of inflation data that he didn't agree with. So you see, the politics of data use is something, and I can give you examples from my own practice because we just the other month had an incident like that in a publication that we co-created. These politics are something that people engaged in data use in evidence-informed policymaking and public administrations need to be aware of. It's not just enough to be a brilliant statistician. You also need to understand the different types of motivations, functions, and literacy that are at play when data is used in evidence-informed policymaking. I have here put a bit of a list. It's alphabetic and no particular order of importance and priority of different motivations and functions. Why people use data in evidence-informed policymaking and what function or what even impact this can have, right? So here you see the description and diagnosis that is potentially closest to the idea of a very rational approach to policymaking, where you observe through data, control through data, and all of these annual processes, progress reports very much focus on that. But we also have here the element of information content, understanding how data works. But something that I wanted to underline here is the leadership and strategic use. So steering by data, ruling by data is something that can be political strategy, not necessarily using the best available data, but a data that supports your own interests. Something that is very important for the political process is the priority selection, so agenda setting through data, where while picking out a particular piece of information, statistical information, an entire move towards a different policy paradigm is inspired in the long run. CO2 emissions, move to the Green Deal. So we see here that they are used in different moments. Advocacy, for example, when NGOs want to underline their cause, Reporters Without Borders, Corruption Perception Index, these elements. So the different motivations and functions also inspire different touch upon skills and meta skills, different literacy domains. And I put that here to show you how these domains are obviously intersected if we look into the functions, and you will have the slides at your hand after the talk. So it touches upon understanding values, interests, so the behavioral component of politics, the ethical component of data use. What does it mean to use a particular piece of information? And what are the moral reflections? We just co-produced a particular data science report where an actor from public administration wanted us to use a particular data that, however, didn't fit with the overall data set for the other entities we compared. And we said we can't use that because it's methodologically, statistically not sound. So the technical skills would have told us you can't compare it. The political drive was, yeah, but we need that data. And people are aware that the data is not comparable, but they, however, want to integrate things. So you need to be aware of the ethics and the politics behind data products you create and the injection of data use in policymaking. So you see here the different literacy domains that are affected when we use data and statistics in policymaking. And that shows us that this multidimensionality of literacy goes beyond the sheer technical skills. So obviously, statistical literacy tells us that in a narrow understanding, we need to have the skills to read, understand, analyze, communicate with data, and also collect create and search for data, harmonizing data across different sources. So this is the narrow understanding of statistical literacy that one would say data science needs to manage. Data science for policymaking is a bit different because we need to have a broader understanding, bringing also in the capabilities to understand what is the backdrop, what is the context in which I integrate my statistical knowledge in policymaking. So what is actually the value situation? What is the interest situation? What is the politics and the ethics of this particular data use? Because if we don't go for a multidimensional approach, real damage can happen in real world. So policies can be designed in a way that is rather flawed. Risk assessments can be flawed. In the end, with this escalation of negative effects, we can also see trust erode in politics. And potentially the typhoon of different statistical data in the COVID pandemic showed how this can happen. If we use different forms of statistics while adhering to technical skills and methodologies and statistical capabilities, we actually need to have this translation of knowledge into policy relevant knowledge. And as data scientists, statisticians, those engaged in data science and policymaking, we need to accompany. We need to accompany this process of translating statistical information into societal knowledge that is relevant for policymaking. And as I said, skills and meta skills relevant here. So just as a summary and for us as a backdrop for our discussion, why is this relevant? Why is this relevant, the multidimensionality of statistical data literacy in policymaking? So if we remember, data use is descriptive and diagnostic, yes, but in policymaking, it's normative. It's normative to the extent that if we look into development policy, for example, World Bank decisions, life and death on Earth depend on that. Once a data is out there, it creates the reality. It is created to measure. So it has a bit of a circular definition by meaning of putting statistics offices on track of measuring something. It's a huge apparatus. Something else is excluded. More and more experimental data come in as different data sources like Earth observation, big data, come in to complete official statistics, but it's difficult to change a statistical measurement and data collection process once established as consensus within societies. And that's just in bracket the GDP question. To have it as a measure for societal progress is an example for that. So as this data use is neither neutral nor purely technical, we see that the power relations behind that exclude and decide policy governance processes. Not only the knowledge that we create about society, but also the power we equip different actors with. So what we see here, and I call that interconnectedness of literacy domains that translate into this fundamentally necessary approach towards a multidimensional understanding of statistical literacy, data literacy for public administrations that need to inform training programs necessarily from my point of view. So what we see as the benefits of defining the statistical literacy in a multidimensional way is obviously that we can bring together the technical skills, context, and different forms of literacies for better policymaking, to fence also democracy in the end, if you want, because of the effect of avoiding missing and eroding trust in policymaking, to fence evidence-informed policymaking from negative effects. So obviously the skills refer to the methodological technical skills of data use, but also embedded in a contextual perspective. Context is obviously to understand all of these different motivations and functions that are out there for statistics, and to take a bit of a behavioral glasses on to understand why a particular actor wants to use a particular piece of data information. And these literacies have to inform each other. And if we can connect that in the training and the establishment of data approaches in public administration, it should indeed assure this translation of data, statistical evidence, into something meaningful and supportive to evidence-informed policymaking in a very positive way that is transparent about data, but also informs about data and data use and implications, rather than just the information content of data. I think I leave it there, and I'm happy to discuss your perspectives on that. Think the main takeaway for data use in public administrations for evidence-informed policymaking, from my point of view, is that be aware of the impact and effects, not just of the nugget of information that you provide. Design training in a way that potentially would also benefit citizens in a more enlightened, more encompassing perspective on policymaking and the effects, impacts, motivations, and functions, and to enable processes that have a transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach to that. Because in all of the different data science and statistical discussions that we have currently around the benefits and the perils of data use in policymaking, this very much lives from the inclusion of different knowledge and different backgrounds to the analysis of the use of a particular piece of statistical information in policymaking. So I leave it there, and I'm looking forward for our discussion, to our question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gaby, for this very insightful presentation and highlighting so many important points. Now we'll open the floor for questions. If you want and you haven't yet done it, please share your questions in the chat or in the Slido, as you prefer. Now I will share the few questions we have received.
Great. So I close the chat here so that I can see.
Yes, no worries.
Better. Great.
So for now, there are 3 questions. I don't know if you can see them, Gaby.
Wait a sec. It's a bit small. Yeah. If we look at climate change.
So yeah, I think the first question goes to what you were also referring on, how this information can then be used once it has been analyzed and processed. So if we look at climate change, there has been so much data and skills invested in building evidence for more informed decision making, and yet nothing has changed. What would be your advice on this?
So I do think a very realistic perspective on policymaking is required in that regard. As you see, and I do think the biggest frustration for all of us came with the latest IPCC report, with the different trajectories, where we think of years and years of statistical data collection on CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, and academic analysis showed us indeed the way forward. For change, for policy change, and the need for policy change. So why don't we see policies that are more radical in terms of change and in terms of regulation? I do think it's worth to reflect a bit about our own behavior. So policymakers will decide radically and for radical change only if they understand that their electorate will follow that. So a holistic perspective on demand and supply of radical policies is important for us. So we can't just blame a politician to say, okay, we don't see any change, but the facts are there. Yes, but the bounded rationality of their decisions is not to frustrate electorate, not to frustrate the potential economic dominant actors in their country. So I would say to understand the overall political landscape in which the decisions are not progressing, and to also understand, and that's a bit touching our own nose, the power of citizen demand and will to change, to ask for more radical political change. So this is it's a bit like the corresponding pipe. So it's not just illogical for a policymaker to ignore evidence if their own idea is, I want to be re-elected. We can obviously change that. We can say 2 cycles in politics is enough for every policymaker to increase their awareness that they need to deliver change. But it's also something that needs to be mirrored in electoral decisions. It's not, that's why I see the complexity of it. It's not just that we need to have just another report with data. We need to change the logics of the political system to embrace change as a paradigm rather than as an anomaly, I would say.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yes, I completely agree with understanding the role of the policy making and how it functions. So now to the next question, someone is asking, could you please elaborate more on the process and main challenges when it comes to start collecting new insight on specific area or domain?
Yeah, what does that mean in terms of data collection? So statistical data collection?
I think this is how we can understand it based on the question. If the person who wrote that can add another question in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so if this refers to experimental data and to the normative framing of new indicators, there are. So first, there's the technical part that data collection takes a long period to develop, to be controlled, and to be providing qualitatively high statistical data. This is the one part. The second part is, and once they are on track, and that's why we see the persistence of the GDP figure as an equivalent to economic progress, for example. Once they are on track, it's very difficult to change the overall discourse without entering into a philosophical and systemic question about the means and the ends of societal activities, in that field, economic activities. What we see now, increasingly bypassing this strong idea of statistics representing a normative consensus about what we want to measure in societies, is the technological advances that we do have in Earth observations, we do have in big data, but we also have in citizen data if we look into biodiversity. So what we currently are speeding up is alternative forms of data that complement NSOs, and so National Statistical Offices work on official statistics. And here we need to understand a bit the hierarchy of statistics for governance. Obviously, international organizations, also the European Union, but also national governments have a strong interest in using hard data of high quality, which is, in the normal cases, official statistics, National Statistical Office's output. The problem of these alternative forms of data is in part that they are grassroots, that they are living from localization. Some of the context of the conflict data, for example, very much live from localization to local conflicts and contextualization of situations. So the problem is there, upgrading from insights from this more local and more grassroots developments, if we look into biodiversity, for example, to a national level, to a level that is relevant for international measurement and indice development, is difficult. So it takes a time where data harmonization and methodological production and framing need to combine the experimental elements. Eurostat is very active in experimental data, where they try to combine mobile phone data, but also data from the commercial sector, with particular forms of household income division and distribution. So I think the biggest problem in the development of these experimental and new forms of data is time and timing in politics. If the time in politics in which the paradigm emerged is accompanied by the option of enough timing to develop, to mature the data collection in a way that is useful for national level or international level.
Yes, thank you very much. I think what you're actually saying links well to the third question, which was related to interesting data sets or domains that governments start collecting data for facing wicked problems. So maybe Eurostat is an interesting place to look at for interesting data set. Would you have an example of something innovative in that field that you would like to share with us?
So the problem is that it's a bit of contradiction so in the actor used and in the level of innovation. So if governments use data sets, they usually are established data sets of high quality, which have a long time dimension, time series, right? And these naturally are not experimental data. In the area of biodiversity, however, phenomenon of bird spotting, for example, right? Or coral reef in Australia, coral reef monitoring by divers. These are elements and these are data amendments that are used by local governments, local authorities, to frame and to to tailor policy approaches. Use of, for example, coastal areas, bird spotting, contributing towards species counting. So these are areas where more innovative elements accompany bigger data sets that are also produced by official statistics. However, if we take the question again, what governments use to monitor wicked problems are the big ones, are the SDG indicators, are the European Union Sustainable Development Indicators, so the container group indicators that proxy non-tangible ideas. Sustainability is a very important one. However, if we look into them, these are classical statistics that were not made basically to frame something. So here we have the circular element that they are collected and assembled to mean something new, but carry the paradigmatic burden of the past. And there we see the limitation of government statistical use and innovation in statistics. It takes a long time to bring these innovative statistics to maturity. But I encourage everyone to look indeed at Eurostat and the experimental data section, because that's very, very good to understand how experimental data is built.
Before I give the floor to Maria Claudia, who seems to have a lot to share also on this topic, we'll go to the last question, which is what level of multidimensional statistical and data literacy is realistic for policymakers to have? Because you gave us a great overview about the good practices, what we should have, but what is realistic at that level?
Yeah. So but that's limited to my experience. I have been working for an EU institution for some years, and I'm still in contact with that. I'm actually not as pessimistic as the overall public discourse about the ability of policymakers to understand the implications of their data use. I'm a bit pessimistic about our frustration levels to embrace bounded rationality. Maybe it's more on us as data, and I'm speaking of data scientists and people who are working on data-driven products with policymakers, to understand that the decisions of policymakers to use data are interest-driven, value-driven. You will rarely, I assume, find somebody who is turning the rational and cognitive process around to say, what type of data do I have? What does the data show me? What do I want? And I do think potentially, rather than policymakers, I would target the data scientists in public administrations to be aware of that. As I said, we just had the issue where we were asked to integrate a particular data that was misrepresenting a certain progress level. And we had a huge fight to the extent that we basically said we can even withdraw the publication. And we went through, the data scientists were all on one page, and we went through cycles of explaining and discussing. So maybe we as data scientists need to have more paramount understanding and literacy to be able to accompany this translation of information into knowledge process better and more strongly in policymaking. And I wouldn't underestimate and I wouldn't understate that policymakers naturally don't have an understanding or a literacy in data. It's just that we need to understand the rationality under which data is used in policymaking.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Gaby, for this answer. Translation has been really at the key of this iTalk series. Now I'll give the floor to my colleague, Maria Claudia. Christoph, I see also your hand is up. I'll stop sharing.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Gaby, very much also for the presentation. Very, very academic, very, very insightful. I would just have a quick question about the politicization of, you said, like the NSOs, for example, and how these, it becomes more and more political who actually gathers data. Do you think there's any way to stay a bit more immune to that, or where some of this data gathering is a bit more neutral, or do you feel it's inevitable that this political process is kind of moving towards the NSOs and so on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shall I answer the question by question? Because I also see some in the chat. I do so. So obviously it starts with a different type of data literacy education at school. We actually need, and potentially that's also a generational issue. We need to be more aware of the benefits and the challenges of data and data use. Citizenry needs to educate itself really a bit more to question data use and to also understand politicization of data. The cases I alluded to are cases, and here comes the professional associations power there, the NGO sector, are cases in which, in many of which, the International Statistical Institute, for example, has become active and has written letters to the respective prime minister or president to underline that this is intolerable, that statistics have a neutral function, that they are a public good, and that they need to be treated and depoliticized and treated in a way that the presidents of the NSOs, for example, do not need to face political pressure. But this is also a societal moment where we need to have reactions when we see such a case like with President Giorgio in Greece, for example, who has been prosecuted for the debt figures and has really faced huge damages to also his professional career, where we need to speak up and where we need to question that. So I do see the main issue of politicization and contestation in the missing demand of citizenry and of the public discourse to reflect on the contestation of the politicization of statistics and data use. You know, people need to understand that it's motivational, use is motivational, and they also need to understand that data is a public good, but that relates to a bigger discourse we have. Why don't we declare data a public good in a way that also our private data is a public good and actors need to pay to use it? So we need to reflect a bit better and more intensively on data use in general and the position of data in our system of public goods. I don't want to go as far as to say it's a global common, but we could discuss that even.
Thank you very much, Gaby. Before I pass on the floor to Maria Claudia, there's a last question. I don't know if you can briefly answer it. It's from Andrea Erde, one of the participants, that said that if government is about to do something radical or disruptive, data very often does not exist to indicate that it's indeed in the right way to go. What is your take on experiments at small scale first and then scale up solution if tests have worked out? We are heading towards more open government approaches. Governments no longer control all sources of data and policy making itself.
Yeah, that's actually very much the way, interestingly, inspired from global governance use of statistics, the current data use goes. So what we had is the first group that focused on input indicators, meaning that we needed to understand how much money goes into public policy, into education, to see if that was supported. The second group was on output and outcome, more on output, so school completion rate, rather than focusing on outcome, how many pupils are in labor, in work 3 years on. Then we had the generation of dashboards who said, listen, we can't just go for a figure, but we need to understand how things work, and if one indicator changes, what impact this has on another. Fourth generation now is on localization, to understand how deeply context matters and how deeply it is important to translate big established official statistics on the ground. As I said, peace, for example, is a point in case here. And there's a project, the Everyday Peace Indicators, of a colleague of ours, Pamina Virchow, who works on localizing indicators to measure peace agreements and successes with communities. So, and if we, by that, defragmentate and localize, we can also learn then again to the national level. So this upgrading can happen again. The SDGs are in a way, so the SDG indicator framework is in a way to be understood in that way. To learn from local experience, also from local adaptation. It will be very interesting, and I can just commend you to follow that up, to understand how the indicator framework will be assessed next year in midterm and how it will be adapted and changed, because there will be a lot of localization discussions going on to see how better we can represent reality on the ground to measure our societies as a whole. So this bottom-up idea of framing, collecting data will become more important. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gaby. I think another comment that I had in mind before was related to, the data altruism idea from the Data Governance Act. That basically behind this, the European Union is trying to push citizens, but also startups to share for free new data that could be really important for economic, but also from social issues, and also to tackle wicked problem. Yeah. So my question for you was, we know that current statistical institutes, they have a long processes behind. And also, when you need to have an instant picture of maybe some issue, for example, COVID, it happened 2 years ago. You want to really understand how mobility, how lockdown is working in a specific country. You can't wait for statistical data, because then you're going to have data that are really old and not really representative. So my question was more on that side. It's clear that we need a new approach, no, to create data that are fresh and also that can be that we can trust. So this sounds a big challenge, because how can government put in place a governance that at the same time collecting data from different actors, but also relying on statistical information that needs to be produced in real time. So it's quite challenging. I don't know if if you can elaborate a little bit more on this.
So essentially, that's coming back to the root cause. What I think is deeply necessary to re-embrace complexity of political processes, to exactly mirror what you just said. That we can't expect something to happen, and the year after we do have statistical data on something particular. So triangulation and dashboard approaches, methodological dashboard approaches, actually need to inform policymaking in real time. Let's take the case of COVID. And that very much depends on co-creation with citizens. Again, reflection on us as active citizens, they also need to change something. Survey data. Official survey data and the production of official survey data, the cleaning is something that is highly demanding, obviously, but that would need to be brought closer to real-time developments. At the more granular level, potentially departmental level, so that you see school closures. What impact does that have on your everyday life? That you have early warning tools such as surveys that depend on co-creation, though. Real-time mobile phone data, for example, but also the grocery stores for the basket of household consumption, for example, grocery stores, cashier data. But at the same time, while we do have different sources that allow us geo-observations, obviously, for the Earth and ecosystem developments, at the same time, we should not underestimate what we start with these developments. And these need to be combined with the ethical dimension of what relevance does data have for us in the future, potentially also as a revenue source for states and for public spending. So if it's combined with a critical discussion about where do we want to go and what do we expect from policymaking, where do we want to go with private data use, then we can actually advance with a dashboard approach of different methodologies and different data sources at interim. I do think we should not expect national statistical offices to change their data collection approach, because for long-term analysis and development, this high quality data based on international agreed statistical standards is extremely important as a corrective view on how policies have impacted. But I agree with you that we need to be a bit more creative in methodologically combining different sources of data that we do have for public policy development.
Thanks a lot, Gaby. Thanks also for this really, really inspiring presentation. You can see from the chat, from the question, that also the audience really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Again, thanks to you. So this was our last iTalks before the summer break. We really hope that you enjoyed this series. And in case you didn't have the time to attend the previous iTalks, you can find our YouTube playlist. You can also find a slide in our webpage that now Christoph is sharing. Feel free to subscribe to our Join Up for future initiatives, but also feel free to contact us and drop us an email at our functional mailbox. Thanks again to our speakers, and also big thank you, Athena and Christoph, for your great support in organizing this event. It was really a big pleasure. Have a nice summer, and also enjoy nice readings, starting from the one that Gaby just shared with us. Thanks, and
Yes.
stay well.
Thank you very much also from my side, Gaby. And like Maria Claudia said, please feel free to scan the QR codes that you're seeing on the screen to keep in touch with us, to leave to subscribe to our page, and also watch the previous sessions in case you haven't done it already. And yeah, sorry for being a bit over time. It was a very interesting discussion. So I hope you enjoyed the little kind of overtime that we did. So thanks a lot to everybody for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations again on the initiative. Happy to hear what the future brings. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.